Is it hard to write poetry? I think it should be. I want to explain. One of the complaints that a lot of people have about abstract expressionist art, artists like Rothko, Barnett Newman, and others, where you have a large canvas that's mostly painted with one color, or a square or two of multiple colors. We often have the complaint, well, I could have done that. I'll leave it to the art historians and artists to clarify why maybe that response is mistaken or naive. I want to think about that in regards to poetry, though. We've talked a bit about how the approach to poetry that thinks about poems coming from an overflow of emotion, or maybe adjacently an overflow of inspiration, that these understandings of poetry, these poetic theories, tend to think of poetry as something that kind of like takes place almost even despite the poet, right? I was feeling so in love, or I was feeling so depressed, or I was feeling so inspired by a natural landscape, the beauty of someone I love, a devastating tragedy, that this thing just kind of toppled out of me onto the page. Now, I think we need to be careful to see that even those who think that that's where poetry comes from, William Wordsworth, in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, probably is the most famous in the English-speaking world of talking about poetry coming from an overflow of powerful feelings. Even William Wordsworth, as we talked about before, talks about how it's overwhelming feelings recollected in tranquility and worked upon by the active mind and imagination. And I think that the way that maybe we could begin to value poetry more, in a way that I think we value film and we value novels to the extent that we do, is seeing that it takes just as much work to make a good poem, whether it's a half a page or 100-page epic poem, say. It takes just as much work to make a quality piece of poetry as it takes to make a quality piece of prose. Now, I think overall we've gotten worse at thinking about the craft of prose writing, but the difficulty of the made thing, the time, the effort, the complexity, the frustration even that the artists face as they're trying to get the image right, as they're trying to craft, which metaphor fits best in which stanza of this poem. How do I get the meter right, or the rhyme really crisp and nice, or maybe the rhyme very odd and off-putting if I want to create that effect? That takes work. And so if you write a poem and it just flows out of you and it comes out on the page and you almost feel like you have nothing to do with it, I would say you're probably not done with it. Now, I believe in inspiration. I've written poems that came very quickly, but they were made better, and I think made ready for others to see by the hard, careful work that comes after the inspiration. And this is what I think our understanding of poetry in particular and art in general lacks today, is that we kind of believe that artists are these people who are extra talented, extra inspired. They do with ease those things that we could never even imagine doing. And I think if you talk to a working poet, if you talk to a painter, if you talk to a filmmaker, they'll tell you, well, yes, there is raw talent, raw inspiration, but that won't get you to the well-made thing. What gets you to the well-made thing ultimately is the sweat equity, is to put in the work. And the work of poetry is a work that's complex. It has different levels. You can, if you're like me, you can write a poem and then kind of do several rounds of editing of it. You could do a purely sound editing, go through and look at how does each line sound? What are the dominant consonants? What are the dominant vowels? Can I organize those to be more pleasing than they are? Or are there maybe too many repeated sounds and it starts to sound overly artificial? How can I vary those sounds better? And so I think that that the that the sound editing is something that has nothing to do with what the poem's about, but as you change sounds, you might change the connotations of words. You can do a round of image editing where you're thinking, hey, what can I see? What can I taste? What can I smell? What can I touch in this poem? How can I engage more senses than I do? Maybe all of my physical imagery is all sight imagery. How can I bring in some sound? How can I bring in some smell and taste? That's always a little more difficult. Textural imagery can be really helpful in making a poem more visceral. Also, in what sequence do I want to engage those senses? Then you can do a whole round of editing where you think about allusions. Am I intentionally interacting with previous poems, with previous ways of talking about these things, whether it's Shakespeare or Sylvia Plath or Dante or James Joyce? What am I aware of that I'm alluding to? Are there allusions I could put in order to reward the careful reader who comes to my poem from Joyce and then sees, oh, that's a Joyce image, or oh, that's an allusion to Gwendolyn Brooks's first collection of poetry. Putting those in there can be good. Too much of that can feel like you're pandering, perhaps. And also who you allude to, what genre you allude to, can also shape the way people interact with your poems. So, is writing poetry hard? Or does it come from a flow of inspiration? Yes and yes. Great poems, I think, do come from heightened interest, at least, if not heightened emotion. But the hard work of writing, editing, rewriting, reorganizing, thinking about the sound, thinking about the physical sensations, thinking about the literary traditions you're interacting with, thinking about the philosophical or theological traditions you're interacting with, that hard work is always going to result in a better poem, because art is difficult to make, and poetry is art.